Hi everybody and welcome back, and thank you very much for that, Steve. That was a really great overview, a really good walkthrough, everything that we're talking about for the rest of the day, really. Now I did catch Steve off guard slightly because of course at this time in SQL of the City it's normally where I start showing you how you can build all the wonderful things that people are going to talk about from scratch. But as Steve mentioned, we do have a special guest with us today, all the way from Pasadena, my good friend and buddy, Arnie Eskandari, who I haven't seen since, well, when was the last time you were in the UK?
I think 3 years ago almost.
3 years?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
and
it's been a while.
It's probably longer than that since I've been in Pasadena.
Exactly, yeah.
So about 3 SQL in the City streamed ago, I gave you my top toolbelt tips, and we wanted to kind of revisit that and do something with a little bit of a broader scope. But rather than hear my old tips that I bring out every time, we thought what better opportunity than when Arne's here to hear his top tips. So you've got something to share with us today, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Fantastic. So we are going to go through our top 10 SQL toolbelt tips to standardize and automate database change. Now, first of all, let's recap ever so slightly and look at really the area that the SQL toolbelt covers, because Arne and I have both been at Redgate, what, over 8-9 years now?
Yeah.
Indeed, I'm approaching approaching my 12th year now. So we have seen the SQL toolbelt evolve over that time. It's started off as a toolbelt that was really focused on dev tools. We then incorporated some more of the operations tools. But actually, I think these days, it's a DevOps toolbelt, right?
Absolutely.
It's got all sorts in there that can help you with everything. So if we look at the diagram that you see on your screen now, the SQL toolbelt really allows us to touch upon each of the areas that we consider part of compliant database DevOps. So right at the very beginning of the process, we see SQL source control and SQL change automation helping us out with the source control area of the diagram. We move into continuous integration and release management through those automated tools, which I'm sure you're going to talk about in a moment.
Yep. And
then out into monitoring and optimizing our production environments once we've delivered our change there. Now, Steve touched upon it as well, that the bottom part of this diagram is equally important these days. As well as being able to deliver change from development through to production, you need to be able to get that data from production safely back into testing or development environments. Well, I say that data, you don't want the actual data, right? We need to do something. So your top tips, you've kind of grouped them for us, right? How are we looking at these today?
We did. So so if we take a look at the 4 areas that we break down our DevOps process into, and I think most people have seen this already. So, it starts at standardizing your development practices. Mm-hmm. And we obviously put a lot of emphasis on the importance of standardizing your development, reducing your variabilities, and as a result of that, have a better chance of succeeding at automated process and automated delivery process. So with that in mind, and also to piggyback on Steve's session around team collaboration and using source control, I'd actually like to start with a couple of tips around source control strategies.
Excellent. Okay. Bringing the team together.
There you go.
Fantastic. So where do we begin then? What's the first kind of tip area that we're going to delve into?
So first of all, hopefully most of our audience are already source controlling their database changes.
We've seen some data on this recently, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So what was it? We're up.
We're definitely up. We're looking much better than what we had a couple of years ago.
So I think the latest...
Still room for growth for sure.
Latest figures showed that in application code we had 83% of people were using version control for their code, exactly. But the database was still down on 51%, yep. Right? So there's still room. There's
definitely some room. So with the shops who do source control their database changes, one thing I notice is that most of them treat source control as just an audit trail tool to keep track of what changes they've made. But when it comes to deployments, they fall back to their old habits and practices of delivering handcrafted scripts or cherry-picking changes at the point of deployment to their target environments. I get asked this question, and I'm sure you've been asked this question as well, which is from our existing customers or those who use SQL Compare is, we can cherry pick changes through the UI of SQL Compare. Now we're looking at automating the process, and can we actually still do that cherry picking at the point of deployment? And I have this bad habit of answering questions with questions. So I'm working on it.
I mean, that's not automation and cherry picking doesn't sound like it fits together particularly well.
Exactly. So the question I ask them is, so where does automation fit into that? So there's a couple of ways, right, that you can achieve that. So one is to build a source controlling strategy that fits your deployment process too. So which means that whatever you put in source control actually should be ready to get shipped to your target environments or be deployed to those target environments at the point when you're about to deploy, right?
Okay.
So there's two ways to do that, and Steve touched on this in his session too. So you can either do trunk-based deployments, meaning that whatever you put in source control, and if they pass all the tests and the automated builds, they go all the way to production. And using features, components like feature flags and things like that, you can turn on off features in production so people don't see those getting into production until they're ready. But I understand that a lot of shops cannot do that, either because of business requirements or any other requirements that might exist. So the other approach is having a branching strategy that fits matches your project management process and your deployment process. So, for instance, if your teams are working on features, then have feature branches where they check their changes into, and then when those changes are ready, then merge those into a release branch or a branch that represents what should be in your target environments. So then you don't have to cherry pick stuff at the point of deployment and at later stages. So you kind of shift left that process. Obviously, branching with databases is a lot more challenging because with code, you just have the text files, right? You can simply branch off from source control, check them out, make changes, check them back in. Yeah. But with databases, obviously, you have actual databases that you're working with, and that's a big challenge. So that's another area where our clone technology can actually help. So you can spin up clones with your branches and have a clone that represents a branch at any given point. So you move away from shared development environments and have branches with dedicated databases to work with.
And with branches, we're not just talking about Git. I mean, the world is moving to Git. Git is taking over, but pretty much all source control systems have this concept these days, right?
Yep. So make sure you are familiar with branching strategies and how to do those in your source control system, and make sure that whatever strategy you come up with matches your deployment process.
It makes a lot of sense, but I guess as part of this, you also have to think about how you're actually going to release these changes, because the strategy that you adopt dictates where you put things, what you put in source control as well, because I guess we have a lot of choices available to us. What are the artifacts that we actually keep within the source control repository, and how are we actually going to carry out the deployments by the time it gets to that point to deliver these changes further up? So what are your thoughts on that?
So I think that brings us to our second tip here, which is picking the right deployment strategy for you. As we all know, there's different ways that you can manage database changes in development and promoting those changes up the chain to your target environments. One of those methods is the model-based or the state-based, where we put the state of each individual object in source control and then promote the changes out by generating scripts using a compare engine.
This is the one that a lot of people are familiar with from SQL source control and SSDT, right?
Yep, that is correct. And obviously the good thing about that is that you're treating your database like code. You have versioning for each individual object. You can see the history of each individual object, and then you can rely on a robust compare engine like our SQL compare to generate those scripts and deploy those out to your target environment. So you move away from having to maintain and manage handwritten scripts or handcrafted scripts and worry about the ordering of those scripts when they get deployed to target environments.
But it's not for everyone, though, is it?
It's not for everyone. That is correct. I think we get asked this question a lot from our SQL source control users, which is there a way for us to put our change scripts in the same repository as all these create scripts that we have for our objects? And there's a good reason for that, because obviously we want to know exactly what will be deployed to our target environment. So the sooner we see that and we know exactly what we're going to deploy and how we're going to deploy it, that puts the dev shops in a more comfortable position.
purists would call that the migrations-based approach, right? Which is completely the alternative to a model-based
exactly.
approach.
I mean, there's, if you think about the traditional migrations approach, which a lot of shops are familiar with, the process is that you have developers who, put together their change scripts in a specific incremental order. They save them up in a location or send them over or submit them as a ticket to a team of DBAs who then go ahead and execute those against their target environments. The problem with that is you cannot really source control that type of a process because all you're doing is you're adding incremental change scripts on top of change scripts when you're introducing new changes.
Yeah.
So you don't really have a history of changes. All you have in your source control is just a big list of files and SQL files that are sequentially ordered, and they all contain a specific SQL statement, whether it's create, alter, or drop statement.
So if you had a particular object that you wanted to look at and see, how has this thing changed over time?
Exactly.
The only way to do it is to read every single incremental script.
Which can be possible depending on what stage in your project you're at and how many scripts you have in there.
So it sounds like neither of these are ideal.
That is correct. And that's where we think the hybrid approach, which really takes the best of both worlds from state-based and migrations-based, is the ideal approach for those shops where model-based is not enough. And basically the hybrid approach is not only we store the definition and the state of each individual object in source control, but we also allow you to store the change scripts associated with those objects. So, and you don't have to do that manually like you normally do. We build the compare engine behind it, so it actually generates those change scripts as you're source controlling your changes, and allows you to make modifications to them if needed, and also introduce any ad hoc scripts that you might want to execute on top of that, whether it's data migrations or anything else that needs to go alongside your normal schema changes.
Gives you a much more complete picture, right? Best of both worlds.
Absolutely.
Which is always what we're looking for. It's a bit like a product backlog review where we can do this or we can do this.
Exactly.
We want both.
Yep.
Excellent. So we've touched a little bit on how we can structure our source control repositories to enable us to be able to choose what we're going to deploy. We've thought a little bit about how we're going to deploy.
Yep.
So now, as we start making changes and we're developing code, which might be a stored procedure change or a table change, and we're putting that into our repository, what's the next step for us? I mean, we want to know this is good. The work that we're doing, we want to know that it's valid and that it's going to be okay, right?
Yep, exactly. I mean, we talk about shift left a lot, but I want to talk about it a bit more just in case if we don't hear about it enough. We talk to a lot of DBAs every day, right? And every time we mention the word automation, that's a bit concerning to them because one of the questions we're asked is, well, if we're automating our whole deployment process, then at what stage can we check, the coding practices and make sure that the code that we have, the SQL scripts that we have that we're executing, meet the best practices and they're not going to introduce any performance bottlenecks or issues in our production environment.
Almost feels like sometimes they feel like they're losing control over what's going into their production environments, right?
That is correct. And I don't blame them for that.
Yeah.
So our tip here is to make sure that you're shifting that process left and you have a process in place for actually catching those coding bad practices and allow you to fix them as part of your development process. And that's where the code analysis built into our SQL prompt tool comes in pretty handy, where as a developer, as you're writing your SQL code, you can actually see where your bad practices are in your code, or even when you're opening up an object for the first time that you didn't even modify and you're about to make changes to it, you can quickly see if there is any coding issues within the object that you're about to make changes to, and you can fix those. And basically that builds the confidence in the operations team and the DBA team that the code that is getting built and deployed to the target environment meets those best practices and the coding practices. And to add to that, for the DBA team, if you're following an automated process, you can basically review any issues that might exist. So if the developers forgot to fix a specific coding issue, all the DBA needs to do is to take a look at the code issues tab and see if there is any issues detected in the script that is being deployed. And that's all they need to do, as
I am
opposed to
so pleased
looking
that
at
you
hundreds
included
of
this.
lines of SQL scripts.
It is by far one of my favourite improvements that we've seen recently. I think what I love about it is when you get the report that's on the slide at the minute, it even gives you the line numbers where the issue is.
Yeah,
And you can go and look through the script. You can see exactly what problem relates to what line of code.
Yep.
And you can actually jump between the two, right? There's a little yellow triangle. You click on it, jumps to the issue. It's fantastic. I think
very easy.
And this all comes from that inbuilt capability for SQL Prompt to kind of detect what we're writing and suggest a better way of writing.
Exactly.
Once upon a time, I couldn't write SQL without SQL Prompt. Now, it's helping me write better SQL, which is amazing. So this is really helping us kind of put together a picture of how these different components within the Redgate SQL toolbelt are helping us deliver that change out into production. I guess the one thing that I would like to touch on a little bit is we mentioned there about DBAs perhaps a little bit feeling like they're losing control.
Right.
And obviously, quite rightfully, everybody's protective over their production environment. So we almost want a mechanism that allows us to really safeguard deployments to production by kind of having a rehearsal deployment first, right?
Yeah.
And this is another one of your tips.
It is indeed, and it's the next one we're going to look at.
Marvelous. It's as if I knew.
Yeah. So, and that is basically analyzing the impact of your dev changes against higher environments. A lot of time what happens is developers make their changes, write their code, and then if everything looks good in development, then we can send that over and someone can deploy them to the higher environment with the expectation that because it worked in development, it is definitely going to work in QA, staging, and eventually in production. But unfortunately, that's not the case always. So and that's where SQL Compare plays a significant role. Traditionally, I think SQL Compare is perceived as a DBA tool amongst our user base, but it actually plays a bigger role for developers where you can, once you've made your changes in your development environment, you can run SQL Compare between your development environment or your source control to the target environments that you can read and see exactly how those changes are going to be deployed to the target environment. As you can see on the screen, you can also see if there is any dependencies that you didn't take into consideration when you made those changes, and it will prompt you to include those in your deployment if needed. And on top of that, you can also see if there's any warnings associated with your changes that you've made in development. So if there's a risk of losing data, or if there's certain type of changes you've made that is going to rebuild the table in the target and things like that, you can actually see those as part of this report that SQL Compare generates as well.
Surprised me how few people knew about the kind of checks, the conditions that SQL Compare is looking for.
There's a lot.
And I think there's 115 rules that it detects breaches of. And people just don't realize this because it happens automatically. The SQL Compare engine is not only in SQL Compare itself, but it's embedded into the automation tools too.
Correct.
So every time a deployment takes place using Redgate tools, we're checking off this kind of list of 115 different things to make sure everything's okay.
Exactly.
And that, I think that's incredible that that happens without anybody even getting involved.
It's a no-brainer. Yep.
So,
and finally, once you've done that, then you can also, get the tool to generate your change script. So you don't have to worry about saving of your changes or saving of the scripts that you execute against your dev environment. You can allow SQL Compare to do that and put those changes in the right order because it does review your dependencies. So you don't have to worry about ordering of your scripts that you've, handcrafted and then send them. Make sure that you're sending them in the right order to your team. So that's another area where Compare can add a lot of value to developers.
And it's 19 years old this year, SQL Compare, I
Yeah.
guess. I mean, it's been doing it a while.
Yeah.
It's got experience of this.
It definitely does. Yeah.
But of course, from time to time, there are those situations or those changes or certain circumstances where the SQL Compare engine, well, any comparison engine, would just not quite be able to manage the deployment that's taking place.
Yep.
But we can work around that with tip number 5, right?
Yeah. So I guess one more thing that I wanted to add with regards to tip number 4. So we talked about, reviewing your changes, seeing what kind of an impact it might make against your target environments, and generate the change script for the changes that you make, right? But you can even take it to another level and have be able to execute your changes against a true copy of production, and that can be done through our cloning technology.
This is the clone thing that Steve showed at the end of his presentation.
Yeah. So as you can see in the screenshot, you can quickly spin up a very small database that matches, represents the true copy of your production or whichever environment that you try to provision, and you can actually execute your changes against these clones. And because it takes just a couple of seconds to spin them up, you can just test the production readiness of your changes multiple times a day as you're developing, and that will give you more confidence that the changes you're making are not going to introduce any issues in production, or the deployment is not going to take hours because a table needs to be rebuilt and that table contains millions of records in it in production, and a lot of other benefits similar to that. So.
Exactly. So this is where you're going to capture any issue. If there were going to be any issues, you're going to know about them now, not when you deploy to production.
Correct.
So working around it. How do we get around issues? How do we solve the problems?
Yeah. So so in terms of the next tip here, so there's a lot of times where customers ask us if they can introduce custom scripts into the process, and this specifically applies to our SQL source control users. Whether that's introducing custom file groups or adding database existence checks so if the database doesn't exist, it will create it, or ad hoc data migration scripts that needs to be introduced in the process.
This is the first example of the hybrid approach that you were talking about.
Exactly. So in SQL Source Control, we introduced the pre and post deployment scripts that now you can introduce as part of your development and deployment process, where you could include those custom file groups being created as a pre-deployment script, or those ad hoc data migrations that need to go as a post-deployment script, for example. So definitely a useful feature. But as you said, Tom, if you find yourself doing more of those types of custom scripts or data migrations on pretty regular basis, then that's a pretty good sign that you might want to consider the hybrid approach that we talked about with SQL Change Automation.
Yeah. So these are kind of for occasional situations that we just want to be able to handle this particular thing. Yeah. If you're using this loads, then it would suggest that you've picked the wrong approach in the first place. And you said about how we need to make sure that we choose the right approach to deploying our changes based upon the complexity of our environment, the types of changes that we're making on a regular basis.
Exactly.
So, we've already gone past that. We spoke about that tip 1, tip 2. If we've already made this choice and we've already reached this part in our journey and we're now got this pipeline all configured, what about if we need to change it?
Yeah, which is another really common question we're asked from our user base. Well, the good news is that you can actually switch from one approach to another pretty easily, especially when it comes to your automated build and release process. Because when you get set up with one approach, you actually have to define your build process, define your release management process in whatever build and release management tool it is that you're using.
Yep.
So obviously, you'll be concerned if I have to change an approach, then do I have to go back and reconstruct my whole build and release pipeline? The answer and the good news is no. So as you can see in the screenshot here.
Favorite answer.
Yeah. Yeah. You can easily switch between different types of approaches, whether it's SQL Source Control or SQL Change Automation as part of your build process, through this simple operation that you see in the screenshot. So all you need to do is to select the right approach from the drop-down, and obviously you will need to change your approach in the development and make sure you're using the right tools for the approach that you've decided to go down with. And all you need to do on the build and release side of things is to switch the operation to build your database following that new approach and releasing out to the target environments.
That's really great. And that never used to be that way, right?
No,
a little while ago, it really would have been you have to rebuild the whole pipeline.
Yes,
but the teams have done.
It
really was. The teams have done quite a lot of work to bring those two approaches together, so that actually, once you've got that pipeline in place, you just switch it over and everything works. You adopt the new method of source control in the objects, the different artifacts that get put in source control, and then you're building off of that using the exact same plugins, the exact same tasks. We just change the drop-down, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that actually gives our, users the confidence that they can start with any of the approaches. We always, in most cases, recommend to start with, for example, the model-based, because it's easier to get your head around it. And then as you progress in your project and you find the needs to do more advanced stuff or more complex type of changes, then you can always make that switch when you're ready.
Perfect. And I see something else on the screen here, which I know you're planning to talk about. So one of the options here says test a SQL change automation project.
Yeah.
And this is kind of building off that initial thought that you had around doing the code analysis.
Exactly.
We can actually embed in our process some automated tests as well, which gives us even more confidence in the deployment. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, really good catch. And this is actually one of the features that is underutilized across our user base, which is a bit of a shame, because earlier on we talked about how you can test your code and make sure that it is meeting the coding best practices, right? But there are times when your code looks good, you're meeting best practices, but when it gets deployed to production, it's not actually doing what it's supposed to do. And that's where the power of unit testing comes in, right? Which is a no-brainer for application code, but for database code, we don't use it. And so that's where this testing capabilities are provided as part of SQL Change Automation and our SQL Test tool, where you can actually build your test and unit test to test the business logic behind your stored procedures, functions. And once you've created those tests, you can actually run them automatically as part of your build process. And that, again, builds up the confidence that these changes that we are promoting to our higher environments are meeting best practices. They've been tested, so they are doing what they're supposed to do. And guess what that does? It gives your DBAs the confidence that, we can actually automate our deployments of database changes to higher environments.
I think it's true. I've seen this so many times. It's that gradual stepping towards. Can we automate deployments to production? No. Can we automate deployments to pre-production? Maybe. Can we do it if we run some tests and some checks and test that we can upgrade and roll back and get back to the previous state? Probably.
Exactly.
It becomes that kind of incremental belief that this is going to work.
Correct.
And I think also what's important is the distinction you make there as well around the code. Just because we can write some valid SQL that looks like it obeys best practices doesn't mean to say it's actually going to do what we want it to do.
Yep.
And this is the thing that's going to allow us to check that and make sure that functionally the stored procedures or whatever it is that we're writing is actually delivering the activity or the outcome that we want it to when it's executed. And you're right, this is, we don't keep it a secret, but sometimes I feel like we do, because it's really underused. And it's one of the first things that I do if I start writing a new demo script with some things that I want to show. I make sure I have my test in there so that I can check when I have to amend it for a particular customer. If I break something else, I want to know about it straight away. So unit testing for SQL Server gets the big thumbs up from us, right?
Definitely. Yep.
Excellent. So let's have a quick recap. We have talked about the importance of thinking about how you're going to store your artifacts in source control. We've talked about considering at that point how you're actually going to deploy those changes out to give us an idea of what tools and approaches we should have to our branching strategies and things like that.
Yep.
We've also looked at how we can use the code analysis functionality in SQL Prompt along the way to ensure that we're adhering to best practices.
Yep.
We've brought forward, we've shifted left the testing by using things like SQL Compare to create deployment scripts that we can review and make ourselves that little bit more confident that the deployment's going to take place in a way that we expect it to. Wait a minute. We have used pre- and post-deployment scripts to ensure that if we do have any issues, we've been able to work around them and overcome them and embed that logic within the source control repository so that our future deployments will have that available to them. We don't have to intervene and correct something. If we see a lot of that, then we might want to switch to a more migrations-focused approach or the hybrid approach as we talked about. And we've seen that it's really easy to switch between those project types. Regardless of the way that we do all of these things, we can embed in their unit tests. And of course, these can be shared across the team because they're part of the source control repository, right? When you write a new test, it becomes part of the project.
It's part of the database state that you actually check into source control. And as a result of that, you can share those tests and run those tests on any developer machine as well as part of your build process.
Excellent. So I think at this point, I'm as confident as I can be that we're ready to deploy. And we're going to deploy this change out to production.
Yep.
But it doesn't stop there, does it?
Of course it doesn't. So
what's next?
We talk about the whole reason why we talk about DevOps is so that way we can deliver value to our customers and end users faster, right? So what that means is more frequent releases to production and smaller releases. So I think that by doing that, we need to have a robust monitoring solution in place for production. So in case if those frequent releases introduce any performance bottlenecks or any issues to production, we can catch them as quickly as possible before impacting our end users. And I think that's where SQL Monitor adds a lot of value, and the way it's integrated with our release process is pretty nice. So for example, in this screenshot here, you can see that we actually mark your timeline when a deployment goes out to that specific environment that is being monitored with our monitoring solution.
Looks like this one's caused chaos.
Yeah, a pretty big one actually. So so catching that is obviously very big, and we actually have this live on our monitor.red-gate.com that you can actually access and see yourself. So here you can see in the timeline, we have this deployment icon here where we says SQL Change Automation deployed this specific version in our release management at 11 a.m. On April 1st. So you can quickly tie any performance issues that might be related to a release into this big picture using SQL Monitor.
It's fantastic, really. I mean, when you look at SQL Monitor like this, you've got such a wealth of information available to you, and you can really pinpoint the causes of issues, not just SQL Server issues, but if it's a deployment that's caused this problem, you'll be able to see it so clearly here. And it just goes back to that kind of chain of events that we were talking about. So you can write some valid SQL code. And that gets built and tested, and it's fine. It may adhere to some best practices, and so it doesn't raise any red flags there. It might pass all of our unit tests that say, this causes the outcome you're looking for.
Exactly, yeah.
But it doesn't mean to say that it won't introduce a huge performance degradation. So this type of link between the performance that we're seeing in our target servers and the deployments that we're making using the Red-Gate deployment tools really completes that picture and gives us the full set of knowledge that we need to have confidence in the latest release.
Yep, correct. And especially if you have an environment where your pre-production environment or your staging environment doesn't truly match that production environment. I know that's best practice, that's what everyone recommends, but that's not what we see out there. From time to time, we see a lot of inconsistencies between different environments in any kind of development effort. So it is really important to be able to catch any issues specific to production as quickly as possible through a monitoring and alerting solution.
And I mean, it's probably worth mentioning as well, I'm sure we'll hear lots more about SQL Monitor throughout the course of today's SQL in the City streamed event. And of course, there's lots of content from previous SQL in the City streamed events and the Red-Gate University videos. But one of the key concepts within SQL Monitor is this idea of custom metrics. And so when you're talking about being able to capture issues and capture problems, they don't necessarily have to be non-business issues. I mean, I've worked with teams before that have had custom metrics in place that check the orders table, essentially, so that if there's no orders placed within a 6-hour period, all of a sudden someone gets an email message and goes, why are we not taking any orders? And so you can build up this kind of portfolio of metrics that really allow you to spot problems that you potentially couldn't otherwise, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's where the custom metrics feature of SQL Monitor comes in, which basically allows you to create any metrics using SQL and save them inside the tool and get it to collect the data by running those queries that you specify, and you can also set up alerting around it. So as you said, but those custom metrics are not always around performance. So it could be, that they provide you with some metrics that are more useful to the business, or some metrics that can help you be more compliant with some of the data regulations that are around today.
Which, given the fines, is quite important to business, right?
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. So, for example, if I go to our custom metrics library, which is a library where we store a lot of useful custom metrics that have been posted by our end users, our experts in the SQL Server industry, and here we're looking at basically any custom metrics that are relevant to the GDPR compliance or regulation. So you can see we have a big list of different custom metrics that you can actually implement and install on your copy of SQL Monitor, and as a result of that, make sure that you are adhering and complying with those data regulations.
These are amazing, and so these have been submitted by Grant. I see Grant in there. Some have been written by the SQL Monitor team, and a lot of these are used by some consultants that we work with out in the real world. I mean, did I see one up here, a backup to a strange, full backup to odd path, which is really interesting, right? Because that's a very strong indication that somebody's moving your data somewhere that potentially it's never been before, and that's pretty rare in day-to-day operations that we see. So by putting these in place, you've just got that extra layer of protection to kind of be informed of anything that's out of the ordinary. We're not saying that these things couldn't be genuine, and there's a reason to do most of these things.
Exactly, yeah. But you should be aware of.
It gives us that ability to look into them, to check, just to reassure ourselves that everything's okay.
That is correct.
Okay, fantastic. So I think, as we're looking around that diagram that presents for us compliant database DevOps, the one kind of area that we had left in there was this idea of backing things up. And we've just said here how we back things up regularly. If we're backing things up to an odd location, that may be an indication of something that's a bit iffy. But I remember somebody telling me that actually these days it's not good enough just to be sure that you've backed everything up. Instead, you need to restore it all, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And this is the basis of your final tip for us today.
Absolutely. So you're absolutely correct, Tom. So just because you have a backup doesn't mean that that backup is valid and can be successfully restored when needed. As a result of that, having a good restoring strategy that is scheduled and allows you to test the validity of those backups and the fact that you can successfully restore them to a given environment is very important. And that's where our SQL backup tool can become very handy, because if we look at the for example, the screenshots from the UI here, you can see that you can not only schedule your restores, but you can specify what type of validations you want to run as part of your restore process. So, what specific DB/CC check DB options you want to enable, and as a result of that, gain the confidence in your backup strategy when creating those backups and making sure that you can restore those backups at any given point if needed. But
this is restoring them somewhere else, right? So we're taking the backup from production, we're restoring it to a server somewhere else, where we're then going to run through the validation checks. And that's all going to be reported back to us within the SQL Backup UI, so that we can be comfortable and confident that if we ever need to rely on this, it's there for us.
Yep, exactly. And since we're talking about backups, I think another great feature that is worth pointing out here with SQL Monitor is that, how good is your backup strategy, right? So if you take a look at the State tab under SQL Monitor, which is one of the new components that we've added to SQL Monitor, is having the ability to look at the recovery point objective with your backups, and looking at any backup strategy with any databases, I can actually see, what's my worst RPO, meaning that if I lose my data at the worst time, how much data I'm actually going to lose as a result of this backup strategy. So, for instance, if you look at the backup strategy for the RateGape Monitor database here, it's telling us that based on the past 30 days, if anything goes wrong at the worst time, we're going to lose an hour's worth of data. So can we afford to lose that much data? If it's not meeting your business requirements as far as how much data you can lose, then you need to obviously modify your backup strategy so you would lose less amount of data as a result of that.
Sure.
So it's a very valuable insight.
And we're not saying this is right or wrong, that 1 hour is good or bad.
Yeah, definitely.
It's just you need to be informed so
Exactly,
that
yeah.
you can make the decision on, is this okay to you? If it's not, then you can now do something about it. But without this information, it's very hard to know the problems that you're about to face, right?
Yep, exactly.
I'm going to be cheeky and sneak in one of my own top tips.
There you go.
Because whenever we talk about SQL backup, I absolutely love the network resilience that's included there, because so many times when we look at backup strategies, one of the problems that I hear from DBAs all the time is that failed backup jobs are the things that they have to investigate them on. Why did this fail? Why isn't it where it should be?
Exactly.
And a lot of the time it's just because of some temporary network outage, right? But with SQL Backup, what you can actually do is ask it to try again. A very simple intention, really, isn't it? If at first you don't succeed, try again. So one of the features, as I say, that I love within SQL Backup is just the option just to say, if you don't have the ability to complete this backup now, then try this many times at this frequency for the next,
And if I remember correctly, it doesn't actually start from scratch, right? It just picks up from where it stopped.
Carries on where it left off.
Yep.
Amazing.
That's really good.
Thank you. Well, I guess that's 11 tips that we've squeezed into there because I've snuck one in. We are happy to answer any questions throughout the entire day that you have. So please do tweet us on #SQLinTheCity. I knew I'd remember that one correctly. We have had a question actually come in to do with what we spoke about a little bit earlier about the different source controlling approaches. Now, one of the things that you mentioned, Arne, was around handling data changes as part of it. You mentioned when we were talking about the hybrid approach, you can actually capture some data migration. Now, the question that's come in is there an easy way to do this? If there's a table of data that we want to keep source controlled and want to know about any changes to, so I'm guessing this is not kind of day-to-day orders we were talking about earlier, but maybe a lookup table of reference values, things like that.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So as you said, there's normally two types of data that you have in your database. You have your transactional data, and then you have your lookup data or your reference tables, where the data is consistent from one environment to another. So the good news is that with either of our two approaches, whether it's SQL Source Control or SQL Change Automation or migrations first or state-based, we allow you to source control data in those lookup tables. So you can actually pick and choose which tables you want to source control in terms of data. So we capture the state of those records through insert scripts, save them in source control, and every time the data gets modified on those tables, we would allow you to check those into source control. We would capture the change, show you what kind of change has been made to data, and give you the ability to source control that alongside your schema changes.
And as you say, that doesn't matter which approach you decide, that's available in both approaches.
Exactly. Yep.
Fantastic.
Yep.
Well, I think that brings us towards the end of the time that we have available today. But you are back later on, right? You're giving us a bit of a peek into the world of Oracle tools.
Yes, and generally looking at what's new in development at Redgate Software.
Excellent. I'm going to let Arne dash off now because he's actually over here to record some more Redgate University videos.
Yep. Which
university videos are you working on right now?
Primarily working on the Oracle tools.
Fantastic.
So showing how we can do database DevOps on the Oracle platform.
Okay, well, terrific. Thank you so much. It's been great having you here. And thanks everybody for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the session and enjoy the rest of SQL in the City streamed. Thank you.